Okay.
My job.
It's in her description. Press button here.
Well, we have, thank you for coming out tonight. This is a meeting of the Downtown Working Group to discuss the proposed form-based code for the Chappaqua Hamlet. With us tonight are members of the Town Board and the Planning Board. With the consultant team, Eric, Bonnie, Joel. Maybe we should go around and introduce ourselves. We have some people in the audience, and then we can start with the agenda.
Sounds good.
Okay, well, I'll start. I'm Sabrina. I'm the Director of Planning for the Town of Newcastle.
Bill Spade, architect.
Steve Tavalacci, local developer.
Randy Ketchus, local resident, property owner.
Tom Curley, planning board.
Jason Fellow Town Board.
Bob Kirkwood, planning board.
Jeremy Soler, Town Board.
Ivy Poole, Town Board.
Eric Alestia with Torty Allison Partners.
Bonnie Von Olson with Kimley North.
Joel Russell, I'm a legal consultant for the team.
Lauren Levin, Town Board.
Lisa Katz, Town Board.
Nick Ward Willis, Town Attorney. I'm happy to be in front of my cookies.
Lori Morton, Curious Resident. Keiko Spade, Architect.
Roger Klepper, Curious resident.
Rick Fuji, property owner and business operator.
Of course, they wouldn't be next to the person from Family Bridges, I mean, come on. Jill Shapiro, Town Administrator.
And Martin Will reviews from the Examiner.
Okay, so I'm gonna turn it over to Eric.
Okay, great. Happy New Year to everybody.
New Year.
And we have a big document. Hopefully everybody's been able to take a look at that and go through it. We've had a good process. I thought we would just put up the schedule just really briefly to sort of understand where we are in the process. So we're in about the middle. We've been through, we've done the review and analysis, we've done the public design process, drafting the first version of the code, drafting the second version, and we're presenting the second version of the code. There'll be some additional edits from that, and then we start the seeker process really in going through that. So that's where we are today. We're gonna present that code. When we go through this, the meeting objectives are really to just review the key modifications as we've gone through them, because we can't go through every single edit, and then really to respond to questions of clarification and have a discussion. So my thought is we probably won't spend that much time going through this sort of key modifications, but want to leave enough time for sort of to discuss the particular items that you would like to discuss. With just a recap, really quick recap. You see the image on the right that's on the cover of the code. I just want to say that we've been through this process. The purpose of the form-based code, I'll just restate, was really to carry out the implementation of the comprehensive plan. What the vision and what the goals and the objectives were coming from that. The second thing is a form-based code. Why a form-based code? Really because it focuses more on form. One way of saying it is that a form-based code really looks at like historic examples. It looks like, how did we actually really used to develop those really charming, wonderful towns and cities? In reality, there were a set of rules. Many of them weren't written, but everybody kind of understood them, and they knew how to sort of create these kinds of places. And so a form-based code, they have existed in the past, historically, but really they're sort of coming back to the forefront again as we sort of recognize the importance of physical form really to creating more sustainable places, more economically sustainable places, better kind of environmental sensitivity, really healthier communities that promote healthy behaviors and creating walkable places. And that's sort of why we do them, right? Those are the goals. And so as we've gone through this process, you have the code in front of you. So just to kind of highlight what we did, this is really small. Obviously the intention is not for you to be able to read this, but you did receive this document. This document really was a compilation of everybody's comments put into a spreadsheet so that we could, in a very organized fashion, go through every item, discuss every item, make a decision about how to sort of move forward through the process, and go through and incorporate that in here, or have a particular response to that. So that's the process that we've gone through. We've taken these comments, we've incorporated them into draft 2, And then we know that there will be some additional comments coming from that. So that's where we are today. So we're going to go through some of the key changes. In the section that talks about the relationship to other chapters of the town code, wanted to point out a couple of things because there was a question. The Environmental Review Board or the Wetlands Inspector approves wetlands permits. That's the way it is in the code today. That's the way it's going to continue in the future. The other question was about steep slopes. The town engineer currently approves moderately steep slopes, and then there's a category called very steep slopes, and one called extremely steep slopes. And so what we've done is only made one minor change, which is to say that the town engineer approves the moderate and the very steep. The planning board continues to be the body that approves the extremely steep slopes. You typically would look at that category and you would say, you really shouldn't be building that on that anyway unless there was some really special circumstance. In reality, the regulations are based on what's in the code today. It's a little more complicated than simply what it says here, having to do with sizes and extents, but that is the change. In the administration, we talked about this before, the approval process, which is on the right. It hasn't changed since the last time we talked about this. But I would like to highlight one thing. There was a discussion about can we streamline this process? And so what the code is configured to do right now is to say projects smaller than a certain size can choose to, in essence, combine any one of those reviews. So if somebody wanted to come in and said, I want to do all of those submissions at once, put them all in there, you could. However, we do keep them separate. And the reason for that is based on my own personal experience. The bigger the project is, typically the bigger the number of issues that there might be. And you want to be able to have a process that allows you to adequately review it, but also ensure that the applicant doesn't invest too much effort or time or money without first getting at least some kind of direction and making sure that they aren't going down the wrong path. So you might say, well, how's that possible? Why would somebody do that? Well, I don't know, but in my experience, you come in sometimes and an applicant, it seems like they didn't even bother to read the code. They simply came in and they said, here's what we want to do. So that's kind of the reason for the multi-step process, is to sort of give everybody an opportunity, protect everybody really in that process. Another clarification was that dimensional deviations, there are actually categories already in the code that says that the development department may approve certain dimensional deviations within a certain scope. In addition to that, dimensional deviations in excess of those already stated, but that don't exceed 10% may be taken to the planning board, and the planning board may review those particular dimensional deviations. The reason we put this in there is because no matter how good we think we might be, our experience tells us that with dimensions, you're always up against some small little dimension that says, we just need to adjust it a little bit. So we need to be able to have a little bit of flexibility in that process. Land divisions, one of the things we wanted to clarify here are not subdivisions. So what that means is that, yes, you're going to have to, for example, if you bought 3 pieces of land, you wanted to combine them and make one property, you're basically replatting that piece of land, right? But you're not typically doing what you would think of as in a subdivision where you're going out and you're saying, I'm going to divide a 20-acre piece of land into 40 lots or something like that. So the standards apply, but the approval's not required by the planning board, right? Because in reality, we already have the regulating plan that sort of establishes here's where the streets are, here's what the standards are, here's what the block standards are. Those standards are already laid out, they've already been agreed to. And so really it just becomes kind of a legal process that comes in and says you just need to divide your land in a different way. So non-conforming uses, this was interesting. Most codes traditionally have some kind of a regulation in there that says for non-conforming uses, if you're going to come in and you're going to expend 50% of the value of the property, you have to now comply with the current regulations. Your code currently doesn't have any kind of standard that says that. So that's something that we were adding in here that says that an enlargement or alteration of a building, the cost of which is greater than 50% of the value of the building is considered a major addition, and the entire building shall be required to comply with this article. There was a comment that came that said, well, what if you're gonna do a gut rehab of the building? You're only gonna modify the interior of the building, you're not doing anything to the outside, and what happens if that's 60% of the value of the building? Should that be something that requires you then comply? I think that's something we could be more clear about. I think the intent is really that no, if that's all you're doing, if you're just coming in and doing the interior of the building, you should be able to do that without having to make the exterior now comply. So that's something that we should address. Reduction of non-conformity is a clause that's in your current code, and we're simply saying that this is something, if somebody comes in and they have a building and they say we're non-compliant, we want to do something that makes it partially compliant but not fully compliant, that shouldn't be a real elaborate process to do that. You should just simply be, the development department should just be able to say, yes, that's a good thing. So. Picture of setback, as you can see, I didn't have that in here, but so transect uses and building heights. So a building height, there was a question, several comments about building heights. And so what we did here is really clarify that for commercial, we had two different dimensions. One was 11-foot 6-inch maximum residential height. One was 22-foot maximum commercial, but that in no case any floor could exceed 11 feet 6 inches in height. And that simply comes from experience having to do with particular uses and different construction methodologies where the floor system might have dimension to it as well. But those are where those dimensions come from. The second thing is that previously we talked about a fifth story, that where a fifth story is permitted, it needs to be designed to not look like a fifth story, but rather like it's in the roof. We also added another version of that, which is to say, or it's set back 10 feet from the front. And the reason for that is because on a larger building, if the roof all looks the same, it can be a little relentless sometimes. So just simply giving another opportunity, another different way of doing it gives you a little more variety. Then the other things here were the story that's in the roof is considered a story. We want to make sure that we clarify that. Then we also added regulations having to do with topography. So if you're in a residential building, for example, it's 11-foot 6 inches, but what happens if the street is sloping down? Then we're saying that the additional dimension can be approved. In this situation where there's significant topography, which there is here, if you go on King Street going up the hill, you see it in the existing buildings. We're saying that it's 1 story maximum, and that story is 11-foot 6 inches maximum, and that's not counted as one of the stories. You're rather measuring from the high end in terms of that area, and that can be occupied. Regulating plans and regulating plan regulations. So the height on Lower King was changed in response to comments that it would be 2 to 4 on Lower King on both sides of the street. So 4 stories is the maximum height there. Frontage occupancy on the upper floors, there was a comment about the language wasn't very clear, so language was made a little more clear in terms of what that meant. 20-foot minimum recess, somebody asked the question, well, if your frontage occupancy, if your building's occupying that front line, how far back does the building have to recess to be counted as not occupying that front? And so we clarified there by adding that it's a 20-foot minimum recess in order for it to not count towards the frontage occupancy. This was in response to some of the some recent comments, but just giving some clarification to understand. The build to lines, when you look at, there's a term called urban morphology. What that means is the study of the change of a city over time. Meaning the city is a living kind of breathing organism, that maybe in one person's lifetime only changes some, but over multiple generations, the city actually changes significantly. The building heights sometimes get taller, which is what everybody would kind of intuitively think. It's actually kind of interesting that historically in towns, if you look in Long Island, Westchester, sometimes they actually were taller and then they actually went back down shorter. And so you just get these changes over time. So why am I talking about all that? What happens is that when we talk about the build-to line, what we're really talking about is a long-term goal to say, this is what we would like to achieve in the long term. Doesn't mean you're going to get there tomorrow, doesn't mean you're going to get there in a decade. So when we talk about the width of a sidewalk, right, what the build-to line is, it may be that today a building is 10 feet, but the build-to line is 16 feet. The intent is that building, as long as it sort of stays there as a non-conforming use, could continue to stay there. But if they were to tear the building down, they would then have to build at the 16 feet, right? Because long-term, what you're trying to do is achieve a sidewalk that's of an appropriate width, that's for pedestrians, for outdoor dining, for that kind of a thing. So one of the things that you find today in Chappaqua is that the buildings have different setbacks today, even on the same street. The other thing that you find is that, I'm going to jump to Greenwich, right? So in Greenwich, on this particular block looking down, on the left side you have a 16-foot sidewalk, on the right side it's 22 feet along the length of this building, and then it goes back to 16 feet, right? But when you look at it, it doesn't really bother anybody, right? It's just kind of part of the city, part of the urban character. Here's another example in Toronto where kind of historically it was 18 feet. There was actually a 30-foot, and the newest building is 24 feet. In Chappaqua, hard to read the numbers, but here in front of Sarah Lawrence, it's 20 feet. If you go down to this building, it's actually 10 feet. And then in Unionville, you find a building that's 13 feet here, and then 16 feet, and in Unionville, you actually find a lot of kind of different setbacks that you find there. But so the goal here with the build-to line is to establish what the kind of end goal is of what an acceptable kind of sidewalk width is. It's also measured from the curb. Sometimes we measure it from a property line, but especially in historical towns, those property lines tend to kind of be all over the place and kind of fairly inconsistent. So in this particular case, we're measuring it from the curb itself. The other comment that we received had to do with, well, what happens, this is a lot, that's an example. This is King Street here. What happens if you have a deep lot, you have topography or whatever other kind of, conditions are back there? How do you deal with developing this property? And so we clarified that the intent is that along the frontage, you need to comply with the regulations. However, in order to develop the part that's kind of interior, kind of landlocked, surrounded by other parcels, is that you can do that and that you don't have to comply with all of the regulations. That you have to comply with most of them, right? You still got to meet the building height, you still got to do those things, but you're obviously not going to be building necessarily even on a street, right? It may just be a drive that comes in, and so there's certain regulations that you wouldn't sort of have to comply with. So under general development regulations, for parkland fees, which is something that's in your current code, we suggested that for projects of 4 or less dwelling units, that there would be no requirement for that. Parking ratios for restaurants, there was a comment about allowing restaurants to, in essence, expand without adding any additional parking. That was a comment that we sort of didn't accept. We sort of said the reality for restaurants is that the parking ratios are typically very high. The parking ratios that we have in here we think are already pretty reasonable. And so we really just suggest that you maintain the requirement that for restaurants, just because they just generate a lot of cars and you need space for them. Let's see, fee in lieu of parking, there was a comment I think that somebody had made about if you're building a project and you don't want to build the parking on your own property, you should be able to contribute money into a pool for the town, and the town would then provide that parking. It's a wonderful strategy, many towns and cities use that. However, we are saying that's a great strategy, but the parking has to be available at the time that the building is built, right? Because otherwise, where do they park in the meantime? If it's still another 20 years until a shared parking structure is built, they need a place to park, right? So it has to be built. I should remind everybody though that there are a number of other strategies in here that help you to address some of those needs. So for example, if you had an agreement with an adjacent property owner that you could use their parking, that would still apply. So all of those other kind of strategies are still valid strategies. You just have to be able to have the parking to serve the need when it's built. Affordable and workforce housing, we talked about this a little bit. I just felt like we should clarify this and make sure that everybody's kind of aware of what we're talking about. So AFFH, which are affordable units, the current subdivision requirements are that projects from 8 to 9 units require at least 1 unit be built. And 10 plus units, 10% of the units must be affordable units. That's what's in the code today. For workforce housing, which is a different definition, which is the higher of the adjusted median annual salary of persons employed by the town, or the adjusted median annual salary of persons employed by the school district, or the adjusted Westchester County AMI. So that's what the definition is of workforce, but there's actually no requirement today in the code for workforce housing. So what we're proposing is that it applies to projects of 8 or greater dwelling units, not for smaller projects, just because that becomes difficult to make those projects realistic, economically realistic. The second is that in a category from 8 to 79 dwelling units, that 4% of the units would be the AFFH units and 2% would be workforce units, so for a total of 6%. And in an 80 plus dwelling unit project, it requires 8% AFFH units and 4% workforce units for a total of 12%. The reason we use these numbers is because 12%, 10 to 12, usually 12 is a pretty common number for requirements for kind of affordable and workforce housing. So that's how we sort of came up with those numbers. The reason we sort of stepped it is simply to say that the smaller the project is, the harder it is to make it financially work with the number of affordable units. And that's kind of why we stepped it. So just wanted to point that out. I see a quizzical look there.
Yeah, I hate it. I just think that the majority of the development that we're going to have in this town will fall in the 8 to 79 category, and I don't see why we would step back the requirements that we have today, and that's what this feels like to me.
Yeah, what was interesting was that I tried to find a requirement in multifamily, right? I couldn't actually find, maybe somebody else could, I couldn't actually find a requirement in the multifamily. I only found the requirement in subdivision, for subdivision.
Or what?
No, it's in multifamily.
For AFFH, what's that?
Yeah, it's in multifamily, it's
Is it?
10%, yes,
10%?
it's
Okay.
10%.
But everybody can let me know what we should do. That's why I'm pointing it out, to make sure that everybody's on the same
Well,
page.
if we're trying to comply with the comprehensive plan, I think dramatically stepping back our requirements around affordable housing does not do that. That's my opinion.
Okay, then one thing I would recommend is that you do have a requirement for workforce also, because that's often a category that gets ignored, right? So you end up having kind of very affordable, or in this particular area, very expensive units, and there isn't a whole lot, it's kind of, they call it the missing middle, right? You're not sort of addressing.
Eric, we do have a workforce housing provision in the existing code that I would really like to review in relation to this, because the workforce housing code is applicable within the designated Chappaqua Hamlet, you know, on a specific property. Maybe we can glean some language from that, you know, and reference it versus adding in a different allocation here.
Okay, yeah, so the workforce, this one is taken from your code for the definition of what workforce
The
is.
definition is,
Yes.
absolutely, I'm not talking about the definition,
Yeah.
I'm talking about looking at the percentages
Yeah.
and kind of the inclusion of allocation for workforce
Yep.
units.
Yep, great. For architecture, I think we talked about the first one already, the major additions and renovations. We did add some specific things in there where minor horizontal additions, in other words, you have a building, you're gonna add on a little piece to the side of the building, that the new portion should comply with all of the requirements, but the kind of major piece of the building doesn't have to then all comply. However, with vertical additions, meaning if I have a 3-story building, I'm gonna add another additional story to it, that the entire primary facade, in other words, the one facing the street, should comply with those regulations. The styles are a little different than what we presented in the community meeting, so I wanted to point that out and point out why that's different. One is, we had Colonial Revival, which I kind of think of it is in some style guides a recognized style, and other style guides it's not. And the reason is because it's kind of a catch-all. In reality, when you talk about colonial, there are actually sort of subcategories to that. And so Georgian and Federal is a specific colonial style, which is what most people typically think of when they think of colonial in the United States. And so that's really, we were just calling it Georgian Federal rather than Colonial Revival. The other one is Greek Revival. This is really classical. It's a version of classical, and that's why we have that one there. Italianate we had before, English Tudor we had before. Art Deco we did as well. We thought that Art Deco should be there. There's one building here that's almost kind of Art Deco, not quite. You do typically find in older towns that there's a little bit of Art Deco. And so what we were suggesting was that Art Deco be permitted, but only in the sort of most dense piece, the F5, and that it cannot be the predominant style, and it can't exceed 20% of a block face. In other words, if you have a block, no more than 1/5 of it could be an Art Deco. Because you don't want that to be the kind of predominant style, but it does add a little variety to the process, right? So adds a little interest. You get a little bit different looking architecture. So it doesn't all look the same. One of the ones that we had was the train station. So the train station was interesting. In the public presentation, I kind of made up a name. It was kind of a Adirondack craftsman, right? And so I kind of went back and started doing a little research to sort of say, what style is this exactly? I could not find anything that really quite matched. The architect that designed the station actually did a number of the stations, train stations. And so they're all kind of very unique in that they don't kind of fit into any of the typical categories that we think of. And so that seems very appropriate for a civic kind of building, that it's kind of very unique. And so because of that, we did not have that as one of the styles, because we sort of said that seems appropriate for a kind of one-off civic unique building, but probably not for every kind of building that's out there. So that's the reason why we took that off. Another comment that we had regarding style was in regards to Victorian. I think what I would say is that when you have a style, we have a high style and a vernacular style. So high style, think of it as being ornate and formal, and vernacular as being kind of the more modest, maybe not so much, not as fancy, let's say, right? So I think that Victorian, when you go around Chappaqua, you do see Victorian, but it's really kind of the more vernacular Victorian. So these are the houses that you see that kind of look colonial, but they actually have the gable that does this to the street, right? Rather than the shed roof, which is the typical kind of Federal or Georgian, or Federal really, they're this way. And so that really is kind of a vernacular Victorian. So I do think that that would probably be an appropriate style. I think you probably, well, it's really up to you, but to me, when I kind of look around at the area, I would say it's probably not the high style, because that becomes has a lot of gingerbread, right? It has a lot of kind of fancy, ornate kind of details, just not typically what you see around here. So that would be my recommendation.
May I make a comment about the styles?
Yep.
I mean, personally, for me, I think Italianate and English Tudor is a little bit dated. And with keeping in the charm and the quaintness of of downtown, I know there are Tudor style buildings currently as they exist. They're not my preference personally, it's not my cup of tea, but the Georgian Federal colonial quaintness and charm of the downtown Hamlet, I think, is very important, and I'm not quite sure, after reading the code, like how far can Italianate go, you know what I mean? Because I've seen Italianate go with Tudors and towers and et cetera, so does that fall on the Architectural Review Board or the Planning Board?
Yeah, so for Italianate, is actually a pretty common style around here. And you actually find some Italianate, I'll say that used to actually be better before they got covered up with some other repairs or things like that here in the town. But I do think that Italianate is fairly appropriate. Now, I think what you're thinking of is like high style Italianate, right?
Yeah, I'm
Which would
just
be
concerned
pretty.
about the McMansion-y kind of look.
Yeah. And so I think that we could take a look at that and
Okay.
sort of make sure that it doesn't sort of go overboard. Because I don't think that that's necessarily what you'd want to. I'm not sure that's Chappaqua.
No.
Right.
So, one more thing, so, and maybe I missed this somewhere, so if you've got an F4, F5 area, and you have multiple parcels, each one of them can take on a different.
Yeah, so that's now getting into a different, I don't think that's in here. Previously, when we sort of talked about the code, one of the things that we talked about was, let's say that somebody combined a number of parcels, right? What you don't want them to do is come in and say the entire block is this one building, even if it's Georgia, right? It's just not of a scale that's Chappaqua. And so there's a requirement in there that if you do a big, long building, that it has to actually be designed to look like multiple buildings and a minimum sort of number of sections. And so you would in essence come in and you would say, this section needs to be different from this section, needs to be different from this section. The other requirement is that the cornice, meaning the top of the building, when you divide it into sections, can't all line up, right? They have to vary so that they really look like they're more different buildings rather than somebody just painted something on there. Same with like the windows and things like that. So really it's trying to say there's a certain scale to Chappaqua. Even if you do a big building, it needs to be designed to look of a scale that's broken up. So yes, on a bigger building, you would be required to do multiple sections, and you would be required to have multiple styles to make it, to achieve that goal. Yeah. So then the approval process. What do we want to say about that? I think what we've done here is really try to put most of the approvals in the hand of the development department, because the code is actually already kind of spelled out what the rules are, right? So as long as you're complying with those rules, there shouldn't be a longer, kind of more involved process there. There are, however, specific things for which, if you came in and you said, well, I just don't want to comply with this, well, that's a point at which then you'd have to then go either to the planning board or to the zoning board of appeals, right? I think legally you have to be able to go to the zoning board of appeals anyway, but we really just want to streamline the process, given that we have a number of regulations and requirements that already establish what the vision is.
I'd like to speak to that.
Yep.
I have real, perhaps it's my failing because I didn't really understand where this might be going with form-based zone codes. But given the topography that we have here in this town, even though we will have these set rules, my take on this in terms of accelerating the process was going to be all the EIS work that we did up front,
Yep.
which I think is a tremendous benefit to applicants, to the town, to the residents, et cetera, knowing basically what things could and should look like. Nonetheless, my take on this overall, my impression is, and I'm very jealous of this, is that the public input is compromised and essentially removed. And we could say right now at this point, well, this is the opportunity for public input, this one time when we do the code. But I've been around here long enough to know that people don't necessarily pay attention at that time, and I think it's very, very important to have that public dialogue and that ability, the escape valve, whatever it might be, to have that public input. And it's not because I particularly enjoy the long process or anything like this, but over the years I have found that there's tremendous value in this town to public input. And to the extent that that is either negated, compromised, I think we suffer, and I don't think it's a good thing. So my fault if this is really very standard in terms of this kind of zoning, but I think we should be very, very careful in taking away the ability for the public to appear at the ARB, the planning board, the ZBA, on many of these applications. We have, as I said, very steep slopes, for example, going up on King Street. And the impacts of those slopes themselves, based on 4 stories, 3 stories, etc., up against residential areas could be very significant. The example, excuse me for using the example, but I think it's a very good example. 91 Bedford, which Steve and Bill were involved in. It was a terrific project. They did a great job. They worked very closely with us, the planning board. They worked very closely with the public. There was a lot of input, and I think overall the project was better. You could sit there and say it was also as of right even then as a 3-story location, but there were impacts and issues that were raised that I think that they really worked toward and resolved. And I think if you have something where it's already preordained and set, and the public is unable to come forward and say, wait a second, that's going to block my view, that's going to block my light. I'm not going to have sunlight, January through March because of the direction of the sun and the angle of the sun at this time of year. These are important issues, and I don't think it can be set up, and I don't think we're that smart, frankly, to have it set up so we have the perfect solution up front. And I think there's tremendous value in having that public input, and my sense is a lot of that is eviscerated and compromised and undermined with this approach. Just one person who has been around a long time on this stuff and really concerned with that. So it's an overall, 40,000 foot, I can go through a specific example, I'm not gonna tie up people on that. But my overall impression is if that is what a zone-based code has to be, then at least one of us around this table is sitting there saying, gee, I'm not so sure I like it then. I understand what we want to do. I understand the EIS process, accelerating things, and I think that is the biggest logjam, the biggest thing that obstructs people. It's very expensive, but if we've done the traffic, we've done the infrastructure, we've done all those kinds of things, sightlines, up front with the EIS, I think we have carried the ball a great distance toward the finish line for an applicant, along with the kinds of forms that we've got here. But to keep it in-house to the degree that's being proposed here, within the whatever department we call it now, development, planning, building, whatever, I think is a problem.
Yeah, it's an interesting comment. I think that one of the things that we find now, because I'm thinking through, it's done in many different ways, right? So the form-based code is a set of regulations, just like any zoning code. It simply places much more emphasis on the form regulations and less on the use, right? And it has an opinion. In other words, in this particular case, it's trying to create a sort of, historical, walkable, human-scaled charm to it. That's what the regulations are trying to do, in a very traditional kind of town way. The approval process itself is different in different jurisdictions. It simply depends on the jurisdiction itself, on what their process is. The one thing that a form-based code does do typically when we look at the process is try to do away with the, what's the right word? It tries to be more objective. In other words, I've been at some hearings before where somebody comes in and they made a comment and they said, I don't want it to be blue. Well, why not? I don't like blue. Right. I hate blue, right? And so it becomes a very difficult process to get through, and it becomes a very time-consuming process, not because of, I'll say, an objective, substantive kind of thing. It just becomes a kind of personal opinion kind of thing. And so one of the things that this tries to do in the regulations is try to say, well, let's have that public process now. Let's agree on kind of what it is that we want to do, so that there's a level of understanding from the applicant, from the development community, from the property owners, that we know what the rules are. We know what we're trying to achieve, and so when you come in with an application, if you are complying with that, then the process shouldn't be that difficult, really, to get through the process. So that's what I think the goal of the process is. Again, I think that the approval process, it just is different in different places, right? It depends on how you design it, and it also has to do with questions like, what's the typical makeup of the number of people in the board? What's the expertise of the people that are reviewing it in the planning department? There's just a whole set of questions that you kind of look at and you say, what seems to make sense in this particular place?
So if I can respond to some of that, I'd be wary of putting too much faith in this process. I mean, I know we're gonna go public and they were gonna have public meetings and it's going to be sort of an open house here on this subject. But my experience is, I mean, there's 6,000 households more or less in town. If you get 10% of those people responding to this issue in a public forum, I think you're doing pretty good. The other 90% are trusting that everything's gonna work out fine until it turns out that somebody's building something downtown, and then they pay attention. And so I think that the more rigid it is, the less service we're doing to the community. And even within these codes, there are discretionary matters. I mean, whether you do a mansard setback or whether you do 10-foot setback, the percentage of property, occupancy of the property line, it's variable depending, you could do, depending on the district you're in, there's one here which is 54% as to 85%. So those are decisions that need to be made by somebody. And those are just some detailed things that are in the code. There are probably some other ones that it seems to me ought to be part of a public process rather than an administrative function or of a public function where people can come in and say, well, wait a minute, I understand what the code says, but nobody knew what it was going to yield on this particular piece of property and what the consequences were going to be to adjacent property owners, to the scale of the hamlet, and all of those other things. And it seems to me that should be something that we would engage and would want to have in order to get something that people are going to want to come downtown, as opposed to, gee, I didn't know that this is what this meant.
I appreciate your perspective on that, but I would just ask, I guess, our consultant team, isn't that what our EIS is meant to analyze? So this issue of would it block my sunlight is exactly what we're going to be reviewing, am I correct?
Yeah, you're gonna have a build-out scenario that takes the code, puts reasonable development assumptions on there, and then looks at what you mentioned a few of them, the traffic, the sunlight, the views, and the level of development, number of units, and all of that kind of thing.
But the EIS is not gonna get site-specific impacts.
Right.
Like, if you put a building
Right.
here,
Right.
that's gonna cast a shadow over
Exactly.
there.
Exactly.
The EIS isn't gonna cover that. If I could just comment on these. The thing a form-based code can do is if a community wants to have a purely administrative process, it's the type of code where you can make that work, and it'll be legally defensible. On the other hand, it's the culture of the community. Some communities have very active citizenry that wants to be in on everything. Some communities aren't like that, and they would rather have administrators do some of this stuff. So that's what, it has to be really calibrated to what the community, what the community culture is. One thing I just wanted to point out, in the current draft, there's a provision that a decision made by the development department, an administrative decision, can be kicked up to the planning board for reconsideration. So if in the first instance the planning board makes a decision based on the code and people don't, and there's opposition to it, it can then be sent to the planning board and you can have more of a full-scale public input.
But the public isn't aware of it because it's an administrative function until it gets to the point of a planning board venue. And if it doesn't get to the point of a planning board venue, then there's no opportunity for the public to get involved. I think this is what Bob was trying to say.
I think what the question there that's big there is, how is it kicked up? What would that mechanism be?
Well-
What would the issue, how would that arise?
Well, I think
I'm not sure that we addressed that.
We haven't really addressed
Right.
it, but, I mean, there are various things you could do, for instance, you could have some
I'm sure of
kind
an
of a-
Article 78, we don't need those.
No, I mean, you could have some kind of something on your website that has proposals that are sent to the, that go to the development department, people can review them. There could be a time period during which people ask that it go to the planning board. I mean, I'm not necessarily saying you wanna do that, I'm saying those are ways that you could open the process up to more public input, if that's what you think will work for this
Isn't there
community.
still gonna be the notice requirements to neighbors?
Sure.
So that's the same way that the neighbors now would learn
Sure.
that there's a public hearing going on in front of the planning board and then would attend and learn about it, so.
But for the most part, there are no public hearings
But it has to
scheduled
be
in this
a hearing
process,
scheduled,
right?
right?
What have you seen as kind of a happy medium? Because I thought one of the reasons we're doing a form-based code is to make it easier for developers to come in and get things done without having to go through
Having
a
to take 3
10-year
years.
process to get a building developed. So that's kind of the reason we're doing this, but I recognize your points also. So have you seen sort of a happy medium in any of the towns that you've done this for, where, we are making it easier on developers to come in because we have already set forth, not already, but the point of this is to set forth in a code kind of what we're willing to accept to some extent and what don't even bother coming to us with this because it's just not gonna happen. To make it easier, but to still be able to have that input when we need it.
Yeah. For projects that I've worked on, they're typically administratively done, versus a kind of public hearing. Joel, do you have a different experience?
Well, I think it varies a lot with the community. I mean, I think in larger jurisdictions, like especially with county level zoning and that kind of thing, where people aren't accustomed as frequently to coming out to these things, they are done administratively and there's not much problem with it. In smaller towns where you have very active citizenry, usually they would wanna be more involved, and so.
I could envision a process where you would set up a set of criteria that sort of says, okay, I've got an existing building, I've got a lot that's 70 feet wide. Does that really need to go to the planning board, or can that be done administratively with a set of regulations?
I'd love to jump in as maybe the only practitioner at the table here in terms of somebody who would use this, and we've actually taken 3 lots so far and tested these parameters relative to existing. But the overall thing, thank you for the compliments about 91 Bedford. I truly believe it's a, nice
Great job.
project.
Great job.
And thanks to
Yeah,
Steve
exactly.
and Joe that they were willing to do it in a way that fits the character of the town. With the current code, there was no guarantee that would have happened. Somebody could have come along with a modern building like it's being done in Pleasantville, and there was nothing that could have
Correct.
prevented that.
Absolutely correct.
So I believe the form-based code that we are proposing is a great place to create that standard so that you don't have to fight that fight individual lot by individual lot. And I think that that's an important basis to have. I also feel like what's created in the current proposal, that 91 Bedford fits nicely in that there's a good chance that many other buildings would be of a similar quality to that out of this code. And so, the fact that, again, you wouldn't have to fight lot by lot to make sure those qualities are there, I think is a great advantage to have. I also think, it took us 1.5 years to get the planning board approval at 91 Bedford. And that was, a lot of that had to do with engineering issues that weren't planning, that wasn't necessarily public got confused by the engineering issues. And so to have those kinds of things part of the public realm, remember, people were complaining, my property's gonna get flooded even though I'm sideways from this property, right? That was public comments. Or it's too tall, it shouldn't be 3 stories. Well, the zoning allows 3 stories. So I think there's at least half of the public input isn't really germane to what we're trying to do. And I feel like this code really defines a number of those things that would enable developers to come in with projects that we'd be happy about. So the fact that that takes away, as it's currently proposed, public input, maybe there's still an architectural review board step to have in there, to have somebody outside of the development department still look at what's the character of this thing at the end. But I'm fully convinced that this is a wonderful thing to have to be sure that a more consistent development pattern occurs. I have several other comments about other things, but I just wanted to.
And how did the
on that.
adjacent property owners find out about, other than the actual build, about your project that you were working on, that you?
We had to notify them based on planning
It's a
board.
rhetorical question, right, so when stakeholders are advised of what's going to happen, they know
Right.
what's going to happen, they see it starting to happen,
But
and they're the
just
ones who
bear
get
in mind,
involved.
the other thing, I think an important point, our business districts are essentially strips that are bounded by residential properties. Guarantee you that every one of those residential properties are not gonna be happy, as they were at 91 Bedford, with a commercial development that might change the character of that lot. I don't believe that we should be bending at each one of those to, as it goes from lot to lot, it's a different set of residences that are gonna come out saying the same thing. Why is this building so big? Why? That's what the zoning already allowed. That's what most of the people around 91 Bedford were surprised to find out that it could be 3 stories. Well, the zoning has been in place for 30 years that allowed that. So I certainly believe that we should not let that continue in terms of the lot by lot fight, and give enough of a specific context for everything that it creates the character we're looking for. But again, that's not saying, right now, I think the code doesn't give any public notice avenue, and maybe an ARB kind of thing that notifies the neighbors would be the appropriate place to introduce.
Well, another thing that we could do is years ago when we expanded the environmental protection zones, the town actually notified, or should have notified, every single property owner that was adjacent to that area up front during the course of the legislative process, so that is an alternative. I agree, I think this is a great way to get guidance, but I think for it to be just done automatically, without the if you're going to go through that kind of legislative notice, that's something else. Then there are no complaints, although future owners coming in, of course, have not had a chance. But that's the way it goes. But if you're going to go through that, I think to Tom's point, to represent that this is that public discussion that's giving notice to every single one of those property owners in these residential areas that abut these districts is insanity. So if you do that, that's fine, then you're giving full notice and everyone's, believe me, they'll be here. And you'll have it at one time, you'll get that discussion. I'm not so sure that's fruitful. I think it might be better to have the ability to have some sort of input from the public within the guidelines. Again, Bill is absolutely correct. We spend an awful lot of time on stormwater and wetlands on 91 Bedford, which was, arcane. I mean, the planning board people could barely stay awake during it. And it was very, very detailed. And again, it maybe it confused the public, but to the extent that we have an EIS, a GEIS here that's doing this and has done this and it's set, we know what those issues are. We know what the traffic is. We know what the sight lines are gonna be. We know what the sidewalks will be, etc. That's all done. So now we can just deal with those things that people think really might impact them or whatever. And again, Eric, we don't often see those kinds of comments in this town where people come in, I just don't like the color, I don't like the windows, or I just don't like it. I mean, they'll color differently.
Bank of America?
It wasn't for us. That wasn't ours. But anyway,
I know.
Often we don't get
I'm
the
skeptical of
usually.
that.
Yep, so what I would say.
Well, but maybe that's the answer, so the happy medium is you have to notify, you know, adjacent property owners,
Yeah.
which we do anyway.
Yes.
There's already, you know, the issues coming up are not gonna be, should this be, you know, 10 stories or 4 stories, because that's already in the code, what's gonna be allowed, because we will have adopted that. The issue is not gonna be, I wanna build an incredibly modern, crazy looking building, cause again, that's in the code.
Right.
It's going to be, you know what, I know what the code says, but we didn't consider that the way it's gonna be set up is gonna really impact my property here. Is there anything we can do working with the developer to fix that? And I think most developers in this town are willing to work with
Yeah.
the town and residents. You don't want bad,
You
you
don't
know,
wanna fight, right.
you don't wanna
Yeah.
fight, and
Right.
you don't want bad feelings when you're
No.
putting up a building. But maybe the issues are not, people can't come in to debate things that now
Right.
we will have approved already in the code.
Right.
But other items, they can come in just to have voices heard, because maybe we can make changes
But
at that point.
would you see that, let's say, the code says you can have a 4-story building in a particular location, and the developer proposes it, and then neighbors say, well, we don't want a 4-story building. We don't care that the zoning says you can have it, and, you know, and they wanna make a big fuss about it, and you can understand why they want to, and if they think they have leverage, they'll assert themselves.
Well, you can have your fuss now or later, I mean, you could talk to people now,
Now,
literally,
yeah.
and say, look, we're proposing
kind of-
4 stories.
That's what we're doing, and we're gonna be having
I think
more
sure,
public
right.
hearings, and it's not
Yeah,
being
so-
decided
Well, there are a
now.
couple things though, right? First of all, I think our downtown district really doesn't abut a lot of residential, right? There's a lot of what we're proposing here that's gonna be contained within itself. So the only people you're gonna be notifying is other business owners on either side of you.
Well,
Right,
going up the
which
hill.
will go
Going
through.
behind
And you have to know
you.
where I am,
Behind
right,
you.
which I
Yeah.
understand, Bob, I completely understand your point. Our
But you're
Zauner
correct.
process, which has been a long one, has also been a good one, right? We've gone from a 20-story apartment building to cluster homes to everything, but I think eventually we ended up in the right place, right? And that's in a residential neighborhood, you know, affecting residential people. I think in this scenario, if we look at the amount of people that are impacted on commercial properties, it's fairly minimal. I'm not gonna discount the individual, because I know nobody wants to do that. However, I think if we go through a process where we can say we believe the town itself, the health of the town, right, will be in a better place with this particular plan, it'll draw better development, right, and it'll create a better economic environment and hopefully better home value for everybody, which will support everything from school districts to staying in town and lower taxes, et cetera. That we have to honestly take a look in the mirror and say, okay, we understand that this may impact some people adversely, and if we have good developers in town and the town picks out good developers, we have people who will work with the people behind them and not wanna get into this pissing match, we'll have a form-based code that allows us to say, we think this is reasonable. Now, if somebody says, look, I don't want the parapet to go up like this because it comes in my living window, okay, we'll make it like this, things like that. But at some point, there has to be a decision made where I agree, Tom, that people are gonna need to express what they feel, those particular people that are impacted. However, I'm not sure that we can go through a judicial process every time for that number of people.
So let me see if I have my impressions of the process you guys went through. My memory is probably flawed, as it is on most things, but as I recall, most of the meetings that we had that ended up being public meetings, because once you start that process,
Yes, you're right.
it continues until things are resolved, were the real challenges had to do with drainage, had to do with parking
Compliance.
and parking would work. Compliance on technical issues.
Right.
Not necessarily compliance on community character. People would come in and say, you know, gee, I don't like the look of that building. But they only were saying that because the process was open, because you guys are still trying to solve the technical issues that needed to be closed. Now, there are some things that the planning department got involved in, which maybe went on a little bit too long, like, does this particular parking area, is this something that can be reserved for later? Or should it be over there? Should it be over here? Sometimes we tend to spin a little bit. And I can understand that, and I can understand and appreciate your frustration that way. But I didn't think that the process was extended because people were coming in and saying this, that, and the other thing. You guys were still involved in trying to solve technical issues, and as part of the process, you were trying to answer those questions. So, the question would be, if you were to do the project today under this kind of a form-based code, would you still have to go through the process of solving those technical problems? You may not be doing it in front of the planning board, you'd be doing it in front of staff, but you'd be dealing with Bonsioli and all the same guys who we rely on.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, that you rely on.
And even, Sabrina's pointed out before, but that, the applicant spends quite a bit of time even before they get putting together the whole package, right, to review that. That's what Steve and Joe has done on 91 Bedford. And then the final stormwater plan is Bob, right? I mean, at least Bob and that input to have to do that, and you have to do that no matter what. So doing all that in a public setting just, dragged it out, I think, right? Maybe our perspectives are different.
Maybe it did because there's a public meeting cycle that you have to submit.
Once a month, right?
And that tends to stretch it.
Correct, right? And by the way, it's a month advance submission to be at the next meeting. So you're twiddling your thumbs for a month, waiting to get to the meeting before you can move on. So that's the downside of having that process.
I think there's two different approvals, and maybe I'm mixing it up, right? We wanna create this standard to ensure development fits character and to be able to expedite approvals going forward, right? So those two approvals is, one is this standard acceptable to our community, where it does ensure that the development fits character and so forth, right? So that's one approval, and then what you're talking about is once a developer comes in to get the approvals for that property, and we're doing a lot of talking about that process around that approval. I know we had some outreach right back in July. Right, there was a couple of meetings in town hall to go and kind of get some community input. I'm not sure how that type of community input into this standard actually would have been incorporated, right? I haven't seen how there's actually been discussion about how, right? It was more of a presentation, here's where we stand right now. I just don't see, so we're gonna have lots of problems later on with constituents not happy to try to approve when this approval is going on, because they're not gonna be happy now with the whether the development that we are proposing in this plan meets the character of our town.
Yeah, I think maybe to build on that, the concern, I think, here is not just the adjacent property owners. I mean, we're responsible for the whole hamlet, and we're responsible for the whole town for the hamlet. And my concern is that, when this thing starts to go public in a big way, the people who are gonna be showing up are the people who are adjacent to this area, because it's gonna affect their lives, at least their attention, more than anybody, than most other people's. And the rest of the folks out there are, they're just gonna trust, either they're not even gonna be aware of it, which is possible, maybe even likely, or they're just gonna say, we trust these guys to do the right thing, or I don't care. But when things start to happen is when people in the surrounding community start to care when they drive into town, and they have trouble getting to the parking lot, to the parking, or they have 5-story buildings everywhere, and how are those 5-story buildings executed with respect to all the things that are in the code, and there's no discretion for the public at that point, other than through the building department, development department, to make decisions about that. And there's no public process for the development department's decisions on those matters.
I totally agree. I wonder that it would be important to distinguish between lots that are abutting other commercial properties like Randy's talking about, and the lots that are abutting residential. That for lots abutting residential lots, maybe add that extra layer of notice and somehow involvement. But for, a lot that's buried within the commercial district, why have the notice for people who aren't directly, abutting it even be part of it, right? Because I particularly think that the form-based code would create the context that development should
So because
comply with.
because it's their town too. I mean,
Understood.
it's their town too.
But that,
And-
is that
and-
what this form-based code is doing? It's
Well, I understand that.
characterizing that.
I
Well, the code's
understand
also
that.
emphasizing the
But it doesn't-
transact nature of it too.
Right.
You're
doesn't-
suggesting, for example, south and north Greeley, in parts at least, that would be a more expedited process, where maybe the more protective process would be going up King Street.
Exactly. That sounds, I mean, I
So
think that
because
that's.
there's no immediately adjacent homes that it would
Correct.
directly impact.
Anytime you get the public involved, it's messy.
Well, you
Yeah.
also
And that's
people.
and that's the nature of the process, the public process, it's messy, right? And that's a it seems to me, that's one of the responsibilities of government, especially small town government, is to let the people get involved as messy as it gets, to be sure that they're being heard. And I understand the need, the desire to help the development initiatives, to be sure that there aren't impediments that are unreasonable in the way. But then I think we need to be careful about going too far in that direction and saying that, okay, now we're done with the public's input and we're just gonna let the developers in the town building department, development department, go ahead and do what they will.
Well,
This whole- this
I
is
do
a-
wanna, I do wanna clarify one thing, which is that, forget form-based code, just regulations in general, right? Need to be clear, they need to be consistent, and they need to be predictable, right? Otherwise, it's not good law, it's not good regulations, right? So we need to make sure that even in places where there's a separate architectural review board, there should be a set of standards, right? It shouldn't just be open-ended, anybody can just say whatever they want.
I agree.
There needs to be something very specific that says, the applicant already knows what's expected of them, it's already legally spelled out in a very precise and legal way, and that's used to judge the particular application. And so I think that, I don't want us to lose sight of that, because really what we're saying is, it could be an architectural review board, or it could be a planning department that's doing those reviews, because those are processes that have been done in many places, right, that have been done very successfully. And I'll even say that I would have worried the opposite, to be honest with you, right? The person who was reviewing a particular project I'm thinking of in a planning department was being very stringent about, you need to comply with these regulations, right? Whereas if it had gone to a board, I actually fear that they would have said, oh, okay, it's okay for you to do that, right? So the public input's great, boards are great, they each have their pros and cons, but you need to be consistent with the regulations, you know,
I
whoever
think
the
review
entity
is equally obnoxious, right?
I think part of the problem, we're trying to solve for two very different conditions. We're trying to address the situation, somebody wants to build something that is a perfect fit for the hamlet, everybody likes it, but they, under the current system, they still have to go through all these hoops because that's the way it's set up. And we also have to solve for the problem where somebody wants to do something that's actually not very good. And you have to be able to let the public have their say. And you have to somehow have a set of regulations that works for both of those situations. And that's not easy.
Yeah.
And I think that's the kind of the middle ground that you're talking about, the happy medium.
But isn't that what the form-based code's supposed to do? Not allow that to happen? To say, look, if you're gonna develop in this space, architecturally, this is what it's gonna look like, height-wise, this is what it's gonna look like, streetscape, this is what it's gonna look like. You don't have a lot of room in there to start designing, you know, a quote-unquote ugly,
As long as
right?
people believe, if people believe that, that's what the code will do, then they have that confidence. You know what your current system, how it works. You know what is good about it, you know what the pitfalls are. You don't know yet how this is gonna work out for you, but you know, if it turns out that the public feels like they're not having enough input, the town board's gonna hear about that, and we're gonna end up having to amend the code to.
Well, the town board will hear about it regardless, no matter who's sitting.
But isn't the input
But-
supposed to take place
It's
during
a job
this
description.
process?
Yeah.
I mean, we
Yeah.
had the comprehensive plan, 1,000,000 meetings, so that has not been lost upon the board, that we're taking everything found in the comprehensive plan with the years and years that took.
2 or 3 years ago in
And
17.
utilizing that, we've also had meetings, we've had public meetings on this. We're also gonna have further meetings when we're looking at the EIS and everything, we're gonna have more public meetings, which we're even we would have anyway, but we're required to have. So isn't kind of that the point? We're getting the public input now, so we don't need it later, except that, you know, to your point, what you said before, if we're allowing, let's say, 4 different types of building styles, and somebody says, I know this is allowed, but this roof line is really gonna impact me for this particular building, they should be allowed to say that. It's still within the form-based code, and the developer can say, oh, I see that, let's change that style a little bit. That's where we need to, it needs to be a working, breathing document, but that's not the same as taking a 2-year approval process.
I think the right suggestion would be to have the ARB take a look at the proposals, in my opinion, right? For the development department to be the final arbiter, the way this is written, it seems, the development department is becoming the final arbiter of what's proposed. Nobody sees it, maybe that's your point, nobody sees it, what's that?
The ARB does see it.
Oh, that's still gonna be a
Yes,
requirement? Oh, I
the
didn't
building
catch that.
permit will still be required, and as part of the building permit process, it's referred to the ARB.
Okay.
So now we have the ARB.
Well, right now the ARB process is.
If you wanna move that ARB process to prior to building permit, there's the flexibility to do that.
Well, that's the truth right now. You have to get ARB approval before you get a building permit.
Right, well, and that's what would happen, but the application is made for the building permit, and then it's sent to the ARB. And the ARB has to bless it before that application is processed.
Right.
And
So
the
you're-
ARB has much more, with this code as currently
They have
proposed,
much more
much more strict guidelines
So an
as to
important,
what they
an
can
important part that's
demand.
not part of that right now is any notice to neighbors, right?
Correct.
There's no notice to neighbors with the current ARB process.
Exactly.
So I
So
think
that's
what
right.
I would
Right.
say
That's
is.
what we're discussing.
Add that in.
That should happen. But
Right.
protect it, I
Add that
agree.
in.
Yeah, we,
I think this proposed code would eliminate 75, 80%, 90% of the kinds of issues that you guys, that slog you down. But to ice it and grease it so thoroughly so that there are no checkpoints, there's no ability for the public to be involved.
I think you're
I think it's wrong.
overstating, Bob, I really do. I think
I
the
might be, but I
think the principle is there, I'm sorry, Maria.
Yeah. I don't think I'm stating the 75, 80, 90%. I think it really will eliminate an awful lot, and I think it will give tremendous guidance.
Right,
So that
that's the
so much of
benefit.
this stuff will be really almost automatic. But to the extent that the process, and I'm talking about the process itself, not the individual project, but the process itself doesn't have these apertures where the public gets involved or can look at it or say something, I think is a defect.
The response is, again, that you mentioned the ARB, Sabrina, you're mentioning the neighbors having their rights to be heard. We're giving people guidance, we certainly, since the comprehensive plan, have been involved since, for years now. My fear, to a certain extent, is certainly there's a balance, as Tom said, one of our responsibilities is to listen and get people involved in the community, but we're gonna stagnate ourselves into oblivion. We're gonna cater and fall over to people who, some folks who don't want change no matter what. There's some folks who will bring out their pitchforks against change no matter what you propose. There's some people who will carry a banner of change no matter what you say. You have people on both sides, and they all deserve their voice, but we have to set the parameters so that each time we're not recreating the wheel, and the longer we sit here, we're not filling storefronts. That does nothing for the economy, that does nothing for our tax base, that does nothing to our home values. When you come over the sawmill and you take that bridge and you see emptiness, empty, I mean, the streets are getting more filled now, but we need to do something, and I don't think this is, and I don't think you're asserting as much, that this is sort of just a knee-jerk reaction by any stretch.
No, in fact, I'm saying that,
Right, I know,
I'm actually supporting it, I'm just saying that we're talking about this right now, the approval process, which is a tiny part of the whole code.
But I would just.
So, but I think the point is, I think the protections can be there, and whether it's a combination of involving the ARB, whether it's a combination of notice to neighbors, whether even to a certain extent, what Bill said before about, there's a difference if you're adjacent to a commercial property as opposed to adjacent to a residential property. These things, I imagine, we can build in to make sure it works, so that everyone has an opportunity to be heard, that no one gets left off at any point.
Either way, you
But I-
should have
but I mean, I would
notification,
just-
right? When it goes to the ARB, you should notify.
I would just
Notify
add
neighbors.
though that I don't think we're greasing the skids for developers as much as we're lifting and shifting some of the responsibility for review from the planning board
I think it's a good greasing of the skids, frankly, I mean, that's the
right.
object.
Right.
to the development.
There may be I guess what I'm suggesting is that we may be shortening the cycle, but we are not lessening the review insofar as we will have the experts here at town hall performing those
Well,
responsibilities.
the way I saw it is really frankly is that we're doing a lot of the review up front. And so the EIS that Bonnie's gonna be leading us on
Absolutely.
is gonna be, as I said before, getting us so much further down to the finish line than where we are now, which is this hop, every single applicant has to come in and do all these studies. This will all be done. First of all, it's a tremendous savings, it's a tremendous attraction because it's gonna save time. So that is gonna make the process so much better. And we have all these other guidelines that are gonna help as well. But my concern is that we're going a little bit too much the other way and making it, I wanted some sort of escape valves for the public departments.
So our task is to build in some extra
Exactly,
protections.
exactly
Can
right.
I just ask,
Exactly.
because we have an escape valve in there now, which is the planning board's ability to review any decision of the development department. So,
But
But
how's
that's,
that triggered?
that's
There's no mechanism.
that's prompted by a challenge of the developer.
not necessarily, well,
Well, that's what it
actually,
says
it's
in the
not
text.
clear and it needs to
Exactly.
be clarified.
Well,
But-
how planning board, ARB, whatever public body gets involved, I don't wanna make an issue who it is.
But I think that you're raising the question, who raises it, right?
Who
What's the mechanism?
initiates it?
Yeah.
And for what reason, and if it's the ARB, that's fine, but as I understand it right now, the ARB is constituted primarily to deal with questions of architectural style.
Yes.
And there are issues here that go beyond architectural style that may be a concern of the community, like where's the setback and how big is it? And if the ARB is prepared to take that, if the
They're
ARB.
not, that's part of the regulating plan, which is.
It's discretionary, you can
It
decide
is
where.
not, it's not
No.
discretionary.
No,
It's
it's
not
not.
discretionary.
Discretionary.
It's
Wait.
16, isn't it?
Wait,
Well,
Right now it
so-
varies,
Actually,
there are
we're talking
comments
about
that,
in terms
from
of
some of you
ranges,
that
right?
change that setback line in certain areas.
There, can I just point of information? I understand that in the drawings, that, the diagrams, it says, for example, 58 to 100% in the category of, and just one of these parcels, in the category of, forgive me.
Frontage occupancy, right?
Where is it? Maximum, where is it? It's
Frontage
on the
occupancy.
frontage occupancy, right, frontage
Yeah.
occupancy, there it is. So, that's discretionary.
No, so the reason there's a range, right, that's so important is because it's literally impossible to come in and specify a specific number.
I'm not challenging, I'm not challenging.
No, but let me
I'm
walk
saying that it's
through-
discretionary and who makes that decision.
Yeah, so let me walk through it, right? Because it's not totally discretionary, meaning that the reason it's in there is to accommodate things like, how do I get into the parking through the block?
Where's the curb cut?
Right. I'm sorry?
Where's the curb cut?
Right, but I'm saying is, to get to the parking lot, you couldn't do 100%, right? It's going to be something less. So for example, the smaller the block face is, the bigger the percentage that driveway takes up going in there.
Again, I'm not
So-
arguing,
No, so what we've done is gone through and thought through those things to come up with those percentages, right? So the percentages that are in there are based on our experience working for developers also, right? And how do you actually physically make this thing developable? So, we didn't just pull them out of the air to say, that's what the percentage is.
Okay, so
Rather-
what size lot does 58%, what size frontage does 58% apply to? There must be a lot size, if it's that specific, that applies to,
It's
a
specific.
building size.
No, it's specific to these specific blocks.
But this block is 58% to 100%.
Right.
So it,
But what I'm saying is, we went through not a theoretical thing that says if it's this long it's this, if it's this long it's this. We literally went through to every block face and said, for this particular block face in Chappaqua, that's what this one should be.
but there's, okay.
I think
I'm taking too much time here,
Tom's
but
point is, if somebody, a neighbor, doesn't believe that what's being approved is appropriate, that it meets that requirement, what's their redress?
But isn't
And
that
that's your
objective?
point,
That's
right?
not
An
subjective.
applicant can come in and say, what's that?
Isn't that it's an objective analysis, not a subjective analysis, either
Well,
you
but
met
if
the
there's a
50
range of
or
58% to
100%.
100%,
there's
So what if it's
Yeah, but either you're in
65
it or
or
you're not.
somebody's deciding along the
Yeah,
way
you're
what it
within that
is.
range.
right?
Yeah, no, you just have to be within that range, you don't have to.
Yeah, but there's
But
a big difference.
I guess the point is someone could come in and say, I know you're 75%, which is in this range,
Well, I
but
think it should be
would you
64.
consider it being 65
Yeah.
or, you know, that type?
There are some that are limited to 75%, right? Maybe the 100% is the wrong example. Where it says 55% to 75%, then the notion of some proposal comes in that's 75%. Well, is that
Yeah.
really complying with the 75%?
And the other 25% is the curb cut and parking, maybe we don't like that, I mean.
Right.
So the only point I'm trying to make is that, again, I don't, to me, it's not important who looks at this, and in order to initiate a more public process, if it's the ARB, because that streamlines it and you have they're gonna be involved anyway, it's one less board, it's one less cycle of meetings, which is probably good for you guys.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the answer, but, I think that in my opinion, I think that these things are going to make a big difference in the shape of the town when they are finally decided as the projects go forward.
I would imagine that an application under this code would have to very clearly define how it's complying with each of these parameters. And so maybe that becomes part of the operative element of the development department in terms of what clearly communicating what requirements you have to put on your plans to say you're complying with all these elements. And then that plan goes to the ARB, they see in a chart very clearly how this proposal complies with those requirements.
So is there a way for somebody to, after this meeting, to take all these comments and come up with a suggestion how to do it?
Absolutely, I mean, I think that your comments are well noted, and I think there's still more work to be done to address the neighbor notification. I think that the town board will have some decisions as to how they wanna move forward with the environmental review process. And there will be a third draft of this code that will be the subject of the EIS. Because I neglected to mention it earlier, I have received comments from some of you, more detailed comments on the actual regulations, and they are worth exploring and adjusting the current regulating plan to be in conformance with those comments. And again, we received comments a couple of days before the Christmas holiday, all the way up to yesterday. And I think that, we want to imagine, we want to, it is not, I'm not creating this code because Sabrina wants this code. Eric's not creating it because this is what he wants. We are creating the community code based off of community input and direction. So there will be another version of this that will be the subject of the EIS.
So I have, I think that it's about form, it's also about land use. And I was looking at the use categories, and the use categories here just seem to be very, very broadly defined for this community. We have bus station in here, there's golf courses in here. Are you intending to filter through and to make a finer cut at what we would actually, first of all, what's more logical to happen here, and secondly, uses that we would prefer not be here, be eliminated from the list?
Yeah, so there are two charts in the code. Let me see if I can get to it quickly.
For example, there's automotive sales.
Pages 17 to 19.
So when we look at this, there are two charts. So this chart that you're looking at, which starts on page 18, is really a definition. This is not saying that this is what's permitted here. It's simply saying these are the categories that exist of anything you could possibly think of, right? That's really all that is.
So it's not matter of right?
No.
So
What is permitted is in this chart, and let me see if I can make it bigger.
The chart on 17.
Right. is on page
Yeah, I have that one.
17.
I have that one. Yes, thank you.
So on 17,
So that refers to the transect definition, F5, F4,
yep,
and
the
uses.
transect by the use category, right? So if we look at here and we say, well, that's an obvious one, right? Secondary effect uses not permitted in any of these. If you look at and you say heavy industrial, not permitted in any of these. So the longer table is simply, let's define what the categories are to put in this chart. And then this chart is actually what's permitted and what's not permitted.
But in retail, for example, is one of the required uses on many of the parcels, many of the blocks, ground floor retail.
On some of them, yeah.
Well, many of them, okay, some of them.
Yeah.
Enough of them to matter, right?
Yeah.
And under the retail category, vape shop, bowling alley, there are a number of things here that, I mean, I don't know if we've really gone through this list to see if these are the kind. Problem with a bowling alley, it seems to me, is it's just a large floor plate use.
Tom, I think those are just definitions, and nonetheless, they would still, there must be a process by which they would have to have approval. We know, for example, you mentioned vape shop, we know they can't have a vape shop.
Well, by your legislation.
Right.
Right.
But you can have a bowling alley, I mean, and that apparently would be matter of right. Under
Right,
this,
but just
That's true. I mean, part of this is, there are two things, right? Number one is, some of these uses, like you literally just couldn't fit here, right? There's no lot that could actually
So
accommodate
why is it
them.
in there? I'm sorry. So the question I'm asking, fair enough. So the question I'm asking is doesn't it confuse the process to have, maybe it doesn't, confuse the process to have uses that are defined here under these categories, which either it's not logical to have because you're not gonna get a piece of property big enough to put a bowling alley in, although there's property we're sitting on which is big enough to have a bowling alley. Or these are things that we actually don't want to have in our downtown.
Yeah.
Why not pair the list?
So one of the things that a form-based code does is it really does have an opinion that says the use is not as important as the physical form, right? Because we did one in Miramar, Florida, where there is a police station. When you look at it, you would say, that looks like retail or something, right? It's not a police station. But the physical form really does make a difference. You can think of things like, what's one close by? Very old example, in Bronxville, when you go there, the gas station, right? It tucks under the building, right? If you came to me and you said, we wanna put a gas station under the building, you would say, that's a pretty good one, right? It's not bad. So the physical form has a huge effect. So if somebody came in and they said, oh, I'd like to do a small, what's the name for those currently, the trending ones?
What kind?
Trendy what?
Bowling alleys, trying to think of one of the company names. Where they sell gourmet, food, right? They sell, they sell gourmet. Yes.
Trendy, I don't know.
Yes. And so if you said to me, could you have that here, and it looked, you went and you said, great architecture, I would say, why shouldn't that be here?
Well, because
Actually, there are a lot of reasons some of these things shouldn't be here because of impacts, and that deals with, I think, the EIS issues as well, so I guess perhaps, I hope they'll dovetail.
So I'm sorry, but I'd suggest that one of the problems with form-based codes is that it's agnostic with respect to land use. And potentially ends up with adjacencies which really are not compatible. That's one of the positive things about the kind of codes that we have now, is it's more specific with respect to those things.
That's
So.
why we have so many nail salons next to nail salons.
Well,
So just because it's form-based code doesn't necessarily mean that all of its finer points are necessarily justified for our town.
Yeah, and so in this chart, that is true, right? In this chart, it doesn't say anything is permitted. It does say that there are some things that are not permitted here, right? But it does give you a little more leeway, for example, in retail and what those things could be.
But if a developer comes in and says, I wanna do a bowling alley, it's in your code, what's the town gonna do?
Listen, I just asked Nick about, I don't know, an hour ago, 45 minutes ago.
Just ask.
What we can and cannot regulate. And so he's gonna look into that and see what we can and cannot do. Certain things we can definitely regulate, like a vape shop, or frankly, I just got back from Amsterdam, if somebody wanted to put a red light district in one of these things, we would say, no, we can regulate some, well, it's against the law anyway, but we can regulate something like that.
It's okay.
But you know, certain things I think we can regulate and certain things I think we can't. So I've asked, I don't know that we can have that discussion necessarily
Fair enough.
right now.
Fair
I
enough.
think we have to hear back.
And I think, I'm sorry, it's also would behoove people to look closely at this list and decide whether it's actually an issue or not.
And even then, it's including but not limited to, so just because it's not
Sure.
in there
Right.
does
Could be.
not.
Exactly, right.
Tom, I just would say that we also have to be practical and honest to ourselves. A bowling alley that we're just concentrating on now, would a developer and a bowling alley business come into a town that did not have the ability to sustain that and have the footprint for it and have the parking for it and have the foot traffic, and it just, we have to be realistic as well. Certainly, there's a lot of, I think we were just joking before, we could have a camera, this says camera store. Alright, if a camera store wants to come in here or a Blockbuster Video, God bless them.
That was my joke.
So I'm sort of being tongue in cheek here, but the point I'm saying is we have to, I think you're right, we do have to identify some things that we certainly don't want, but I think the market also, we're doing a development not for developers. The misconception is that we are making this for developers, we're doing this for our community to make it viable and sustainable and healthy. So we're going to build what we think, or no, we're not gonna build anything, we're gonna build a code that we think makes that happen. But yes, we should probably find certain things we want to, as long as it's legally permissible to exclude, but we also think have to be realistic, you know, what.
Well, I'm not being unrealistic, I mean, most of this on this page is perfectly fine to me. I mean, it's the kind of thing you'd wanna have, I'm just suggesting that there are some things that you maybe don't wanna have, and not let the market command the development of this town. That's the biggest mistake you can make, is to give them a carte blanche. Because look at all the towns around this country that let that happen, and it's a disaster.
That's what we're trying to do this.
Let's hold that until we get legal guidance on the rest of this.
In my travels around the county, there are investors in property who won't come here because the examples they can cite, and we all know them, they say it takes forever, I'm not gonna bother, I won't even look at it, you know, so buildings come up that are available, and I'll talk to people I know, and they, no, I'm not going there. Well, you know, the process isn't nearly as bad, you know, the Reader's Digest, Summit Greenfield, that was a particular example, don't tell me about it. Big developers also, who are looking at other towns that are doing larger scale developments, they're not interested in this town because the examples they can cite are just such a painful
I'm
process.
just talking about a bowling alley, I mean, I agree with you.
Well, yeah.
I mean, I agree with you,
Yeah.
that this is a problem we're trying to address.
Right.
Small boy, like the small
That was my,
Small. No, Vermont.
It's like skee ball.
Can I just point one thing out about this chart, is that the definition is the legally enforceable piece. The examples that are in the right column aren't necessarily, I mean, if it's in there, and then I think it would be presumed that it would fit into the definition, but it's the definition that the development department will be looking at is, you know, does the proposed use fit that definition? And the examples are instructive and they help give guidance, but they aren't definitive, I mean, they aren't everything.
So can I ask about the floor-to-floor heights? You have 11.6 for residential. Can you tell me how that sandwich works?
So one of the things
And
that we've
the
been.
building type we're talking about?
Yeah, one of the things that we've been seeing, everybody's kind of seen, right, the push to 9-foot ceilings, right, from 8 to 9s. We've been seeing a push to even taller ceilings, 10-foot ceilings, right? And so that's where the 11.6 comes from.
Smaller places, bigger ceilings.
What's the floor-to-floor?
We got
9.4 is the shortest.
And it's a slab, right?
It's a slab, so the ceiling height, well, no, sorry, we're talking about a particular building.
Just an example.
So it's a foot of structure, so the ceiling height is 8.4, and then we squeezed it to get to 8.4, it would have been 8 feet had we not done that. So,
But you were limited by our 35
by
foot.
the 35-foot height limit, right?
Which is you know, it's a very different problem that they had to solve for them.
That's right.
And hopefully with this code, they don't have to solve it. I don't know if you're going this way, but my take on it was the 11.6 was going to be restrictive. My sense is that residential are now going toward 10, 12-foot ceilings in new residential construction. So
So in a concrete, which I imagine this
Have you seen
scale,
that,
we're
Steve?
probably
No?
talking about
Yeah, I
concrete.
mean, minimum 10 feet, first
Yeah.
floor is what I built today. On
Yeah,
residential.
if you're doing-
Floor.
So the
First
no,
floor.
first floor is, yeah. So it's really 11 feet.
It's 11, right?
Yeah.
It's
So-
the minimum.
And
Yeah,
it's,
10-foot retail,
it's concrete
So
construction.
my question about building heights, which I had put in the comments, and I don't know if you resolved it or not, or if you did. But with regard to in the commercial, so the form-based code regulates the total number of stories, right?
Correct.
The-
Yes.
As opposed to the heights, right? And so when it's commercial as opposed to residential, we said a commercial building or a commercial first floor could be 20, 22, I
Yeah,
can't
it
remember
was,
what we said.
Right, it was 22
And my concern was
Yep.
that if you're 22 and you're allowing 3 above it, all of a sudden you've got what is in essence has a height that is equivalent to 5 stories, even if it is 4 stories. So I was feeling like if it went above the 11.6, there ought to be then a corollary decrease in the number of stories that were allowed.
Which
Or
effectively puts an
alternatively, an
overall
overall
cap.
height restriction.
Right. There ought to be some mechanism there,
Right.
so that
Yeah.
all of a sudden we
An
don't
overall
think
height
we're allowing 4 stories, but actually we're allowing 5
Right, and
because
and
that
that
first
is
story is
something,
22 feet
Right.
high.
that is something that has been commented on, and I had a quick conversation with Eric, before the meeting, and Eric feels, I'm not gonna speak for you, but we had talked about needing 2 different heights for commercial versus residential on the first floor.
No, and I think that makes good
But
sense.
that 22 is really too tall, that we would be more like a 16. And the question, and I've spoken with Bill about this, 16 is that, where does that fall in the realm of commercial uses that we would expect to see here?
I see.
And I think it's perfectly appropriate. You go to most historic areas of, the city, wherever, and that first floor at about 14 to 16 feet is very common. And so 22, I think, is way beyond what
But
you
it
need.
also helps, the higher height helps in smaller spaces for retail to get storage. One of the problems getting bigger retailers in here, and I don't mean, Target. I mean, what's that?
Mezzanine.
Yeah, mezzanine storage, you typically don't have basements, everything's wet here, so you can't go down, so you gotta put somewhere.
That's interesting.
So you're either taking up part of your store in the back to make storage, or you're actually leaving all your inventory out on the racks, you just gotta put it up higher. So the ceiling height does give you an advantage when you're starting to do inventory within the store.
Right, and so based on Bill's practical experience, even Eric's experience and other comments, 16, speaking with Greg Sanzari, and Greg would like much taller, but 16 is reasonable for Chappaqua.
Yeah,
I don't know
And
how
I
I
have
how
think
to
one
it's
come to that
important to
conclusion,
have the
but-
overall building height restrictions.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, to take your example one step further and go to the 5-story building, it's permitted to go as high as 66 feet if you add up all these. And that's a 6.5-story building.
I didn't give the 5-story example for a reason, which is that there are very few areas within this form-based code as is drafted today where 5-story buildings were allowed.
It's still a 6-story.
So I wanna make sure that is communicated to everybody really clearly,
Yeah.
that 5 stories is not allowed throughout the.
But a 5-story
Right.
building is 66 feet.
Right, well,
Allowed.
that's what we need to address to make sure that
Right,
that doesn't
yeah.
happen.
So
I
that's
have
not a
one more thing
5-story
to
building.
add to ceiling height.
In people's perception.
In my opinion, and I did a memo about this, I think we're looking for a consistency in character. So to me, anything, whether residential or commercial, that first floor ought to be consistent. An 11.5 feet residential floor is the same height as the upper floors, means that if you've got one that allows residential next to one that allows commercial, now you've got a potentially 4.5 foot height difference between the two. And the residential one will have this very even pattern going up the building, whereas the commercial one has the taller first floor. In my opinion, even if it's residential, it should still be, I said 14 to 16 feet. I think we should maintain that character, So if you are allowed to do.
Well, keep in mind,
Yeah.
half of our hamlet is on a hill, so you're
Right.
not gonna get that to line up anyway.
Yeah, so,
Well,
if I could comment
But do you really
two
care?
things to
Because
that.
I feel like,
Let
I
Eric
actually
talk
like
about
where there's a difference, I don't think everything
Well,
should be uniform.
but a difference should be an evolution of that design of that building. A difference shouldn't be legislated. So saying a residential building is only 11.5 feet, you know, obviously most people are gonna build it to the height, likely the maximum height they could do. So I just feel like that's an artificially low number for a first floor character, and you look at the renderings, which I
So
think
why
are
wouldn't we have a
beautiful.
minimum though, and not worry about a maximum? Because what if you wanna take 4 stories and make two-story lofts? Make 30-foot ceilings, two
Right.
30-foot ceilings and have lofts in it.
With a climbing
Why
wall
wouldn't
inside.
we allow that versus saying, okay, we have a minimum for the
So,
first.
yeah, with the code, okay, let me comment on several things, so,
Yes.
what the code says is that if you're gonna do a loft, right, you can, but that counts as 2 stories.
Yeah.
Not necessarily.
I'm not saying,
Linda.
yeah.
Up to 30%
Yeah.
of the adjacent floor area, you can have a mezzanine that doesn't count as a story, which is exactly led in New York City. People were building 6-story buildings but had 100 feet of height because they were creating mezzanine levels and doing
But you're talking about
double-story
building
spaces.
code, right? I'm talking about the zoning code.
Right.
Has its own regulation that says, if you wanna do a loft, you can do a loft, but it's considered a 2-story building,
But my
not a
point-
1-story.
But my point was just set a minimum ceiling height for residential on the first floor, right? But if you
Yeah.
wanna make a, don't set a maximum, or just say you maximum building height. So you can build whatever you want in that envelope, right? I can build 2 lofts, I can build 4 stories, I can build, 11 foot, I can build 3 stories at 18 feet.
Put an atrium in front.
So, let me go back to one of the comments. In my mind, one of the charming things about a historic neighborhood, right, is that you actually do get variety in heights. And so having floors not line up is actually something we actually legislate, that when you're gonna do a big building that looks like multiple buildings, that they have to actually not line up, right? That the base has to be a different height. The cornices have to be a different height, because it just helps to break it down and visually be more human scaled. So the idea that you have 2 different first floor heights, I think is actually a good thing. That they not be different, that they be different.
But to Ivy's point, it is really important, and like we're saying, if somebody wants to do loft apartments, well, they may say, well, this 2 floors is really only 1 floor, so I can build up. I think we do need
Yeah, and
maximum
that's in there.
building height.
Well, that's in there basically saying, if you do a loft,
Well, the loft, I was just using an
No, no, no.
example, but
Regardless, there needs to be a maximum.
a maximum building height for each,
Transect.
for each,
We don't want the
yeah.
functional equivalent of a
Zone.
6.5-story building or 6-story building.
Right.
A 3-story can only be this maximum this high, 4-story maximum this high, 5-story maximum.
yeah, we'll go back and study the math on it.
So, since we're talking about
We'll go back and study it.
about building height, I did notice, and maybe I'm wrong, but F5 allows a 5-story building, correct?
It does, but then we regulate each individual block with
It
16
allows
blocks.
it allows that to be the absolute maximum height,
By
Right.
right.
except that the regulating plan overrides that, right? So if you were in a F5, but the regulating plans says you can only do 4 here, then
Okay, I
you can only
see,
do
2
4.
to 5, 2 to 5, 2 to 4 in one side of Greeley Street, it's an F5 zone, but it's 2 to 4 stories, is that what we're saying?
So that regulating plan takes precedence.
And the 2 to 5, the 5 is essentially around the train station.
Yes. And what we did, and also in response to some of the comments, typically what happens is 5 is only allowed, A, closer to the station, and B, only when it's like against the tracks or against an open space. Never when it's like 2 buildings facing each other.
So, I also noticed that, in that zone around the train station, where there is no development right now, ground floor retail is required in that zone.
Yeah.
How much retail, added retail square footage is there in this code?
Enough for 2 bowling alleys.
Town Bob, we're not gonna let that one down, it's gonna go with you forever.
We're only 3 minutes.
Enjoy the Christmas party now.
Folks, I wanna be mindful.
Yeah.
Bonnie was gonna say she had, I don't have it, well, here, let's see.
We should get out a bowling ball as it goes away.
I'd just like to know how much we're requiring.
Yeah, seriously.
I don't have the numbers with me right now.
Isn't that kind of important, the
It's not.
the relationship between, the relationship between the amount of residential that we're adding and the amount of retail that we're adding?
That's another we need to.
And that's required.
Yeah, so.
It's required.
That's important. So this is, now let me clarify, right? So this is, we tried to kind of limit where it's required, right? To only kind of key places. Doesn't mean you couldn't have more than that, right? But based on what's drawn, it's really only an increase of about 20,000 square feet of retail.
Of required.
Of
Required additional.
Yes.
And how many added residential units are there in this plan?
Just under 1,000.
I'm just under 1,000.
Right, and we should be clear, when we say how many residential users are added to spend, we are not selling, that I'm aware of, the train station to build out 1,000 or whatever, 100, 200, 300 units. So I think we should have perspective, this is just giving us, again, the form to follow should we make these decisions. And just as a secondary question, in the event that a town board today or many tomorrows later decided to sell the train station parking lot and more, I guess, to Nick, you know, what could we have put in place at that point in time to say, well, we don't want X, even though the code allows for it, or would be stuck at that point?
Well,
You're talking about the town's property?
Right, if ultimately we wanted to sell the property to a developer, because I think people have to understand that here, 1,000, this is built out for 1,000, this isn't happening, we have town property, we have to sell everything we own to make this happen, which is simply not.
Well, not even just that, you'd have to redevelop
You'd also
all
have
the.
to tear down everything that exists today and build all new.
Right, so
You control your property, so you can control what you sell for what development rights you grant to it, as well as putting
Okay.
these restrictions in it.
So the question I would ask is, why is this why is the town property part of the form-based code? Because it encumbers that process. This is a decision that maybe is being made
It
prematurely.
encumbers that process?
I can't speak to that policy.
What does that mean?
It encumbers the process of going through and being able to make your own decision about this land when you decide you want to redevelop it. You no longer really have a choice because the code says that this is what has to happen.
You absolutely have a choice. The property is not up for sale, nor is it going up for sale
Well, then why
unless
is
the
this
public
Then why is it, okay, so that begs
votes
the
through a
question.
public referendum to allow us to sell the property.
It begs the
But
question.
then if they do, I'm sorry,
Yeah,
let
but
me,
no, go ahead,
let me finish. If they do make the decision that they wanna sell the property, we have constrained the developers by setting forth a form-based code that says you must build to these standards. We are in fact protecting that future potential, not undercutting or giving it away.
So, unless I'm wrong, the day that you put this up for sale, you can impose those constraints to any developer, any constraints you want to any developer as a qualification.
I could,
of
and you
development.
could trust me to do that, but we're putting in place a zoning ordinance that's going to outlast me and
Exactly.
everybody else in this room, because the zoning code today is 40+ years old, so we're planning for the future here. And we're being proscriptive about what that future looks like so that we've constrained it, so that we build to the future that this town board and this working group has in mind.
So what you're doing is you are encumbering, constraining future town boards in their decisions about what this town may be 10 years from now, 15 years from now. And there may be a completely different, I guarantee you, there will be a completely different market thank you.
Well, the zoning
Market
code should be
conditions.
amended
I
20 years
don't understand why putting the constraints on now makes any sense.
It creates a set of expectations about what's going to happen in that area that is important, I think.
There are no expectations.
No, that's.
Well, no, the code sets expectations.
It says.
That's the issue, I think that's the issue Tom's
That's the
raising.
issue.
But you want, but the thing is, that if the town board decided they wanna do something completely different with
Yeah.
that property and the public
10,
supported
15
it,
years from now.
they could, I mean, they can amend the code to allow it.
Absolutely.
And a new
So-
comprehensive plan at that point, because you'd be that far out that there would be.
But I guess I don't understand.
You will, would you not?
Well,
Hopefully in the next 10 to
Or
15
at
years.
least an update.
Yeah.
We should have it updated in 5 years technically, but.
I mean, you're right that it ties
don't
the hands to
understand-
some
yes,
extent, but they can be untied too.
But why tie them?
To be
Just to have
so-
to untie them?
Well, I have seen situations where a town put public property up for sale.
Yeah.
And they had all kinds of specifications, the RFP and everything, and developers come in and, just like they do with codes, they said, this is what I wanna do, and they, they lobby for it and they.
And let's say we're in a different financial situation than we are today and our hands are
Yeah, so
tied and all of a sudden
I
we
think
need to make
creating
a
a-
sale and
Well, in which, I mean, that's,
something really ugly that none of us want.
right.
Yeah, I mean, just to clarify, what it does is it establishes
It's
that
illogical.
there's a certain character that's Chappaqua today, right? And it comes in and it says that's the character that should also be established there if the town decided to develop that property. But to clarify, because the town owns it, let's say it says 5 stories, right? If the town decided in the future that, oh, we like the idea of a bigger green, but we think it should be 4 stories. The town could basically say, it's my land, that's the restriction for anybody that wanted to lease the land or buy the land.
But what this allows it to do, I'm sorry, is that it allows a developer to come in with a set of expectations to say, let me take a look at this, let me pencil this out and say, I might go to the town and make them an offer, right? I might be able to do this, right? This makes numerical sense to me, there's a reason to do this here. If the town becomes more popular and things start to happen, town may not have it up for sale. But I might stand in front of the town board and say, look, I'm interested. I saw the expectations, I understand the cost of construction, I understand the limitations and what you want there, and therefore, I think I can make that happen. Are you interested?
And what it also allows us to do is to treat the train station area the same as we're treating the town. So we're putting restrictions on how we want buildings to look, like how high we want them to be. We're kind of treating it as one area as opposed to 2 completely separate and distinct areas. We want the town to look the same. Or to not look the same, but to be under the same guidelines.
That's fair enough, so the commitment then, the implication then is that the town board, today's town board believes that this kind of development, 5-story development with mandatory retail on the ground floor in this location is something that you're willing to commit to, at least in the code.
No, we're not committing to anything.
You're
We're
putting
not
in-
selling. We're opening doors to those possibilities. We're willing to entertain future conversations. We're not committing to it. I mean, that's really an unfair characterization.
You are directing the conversation to invite those proposals.
Well, what's
I use the word.
I'm not putting out an RFQ. I'm not inviting proposals. I'm not.
No, but that's clearly the expectation. The expectation, if I came in and I said, okay, what's happening with this property, I hear you're doing something, you would hand me the code and you'd say, this is what we've approved for those areas,
You wouldn't say-
should we sell it, or,
You wouldn't say, don't look at this.
I know, but you know what, Tom, we still, again, I go back, we still have a comprehensive plan, the entire town, let alone the Hamlet, wants to maintain this, the tranquility, that's the word I'm looking for, I apologize. Just having the quaintness of the Hamlet, there's a traffic issue in the Hamlet, there's a lot of different things there's a quality of life in the Hamlet that the town wants to maintain, hence the comprehensive plan, so everything still has to follow, it's not just we're going to sell this off, it's just not.
Well, I think there's,
If I may a minute, cause we're gonna run into some time issues, I like to keep to timing, I know the town board has meetings after this. We have until 8:30, I know that Bonnie was going to give a kind of an overview of SECRA. I do wanna say that this is a code that covers the downtown hamlet. The public property is part of that hamlet. In order for public property to be sold, it has to go to public referendum and has a process in and of itself. So I wanna say that, right now this area is zoned as light industrial, and if you look at the uses in industrial categories in the code today, you could see what could happen to this property, and it is not consistent with everything that has been identified during the public process. Regardless, I wanna turn it back over to Bonnie and Eric so they can wrap up so we can stay on time.
I understand that everybody has other things to do. I just wanna be sure that everybody understands that once it's in here, there is an implication, a stated implication that this is what the town is looking for on this piece of property, otherwise it wouldn't be in the legislated zoning code. And that's just I mean, that's what everybody's gonna read into it.
Well, right now it's
And maybe
light
that's what you
industrial.
want, and that's
Yeah,
fine,
exactly.
maybe
So
that's what you
we're-
want, but that's a consequence of what you're doing.
Well, the consequence to keep it now is that say, light industrial development, come on down, the price is right, you're the next contestant.
But
No,
Tom,
that's not
don't
what you
forget,
do.
don't forget though,
I mean,
it
come on,
also
wait,
says
that's
up
not
to
fair.
5 stories, it's not saying, please put 5-story apartment buildings here. It's saying that's the only place in this town that if we were gonna allow it, would be there.
Maybe you don't want residential there. And to say that it's light and you do the same thing you're gonna do anyway, is you put out an RFP and say, here's this piece of property, and we are interested in development on this piece of property, and these are the restrictions and the conditions of that development. You'd be doing the same thing, right? It's just, I'll say it one last time and then I'm done, it's just that why tie yourself, I know you're not tying yourself, but why put out the message and the expectations? Because expectations have a way of becoming reality. Once you get down that road and the train starts moving, very often it takes on its own life, and it's really hard to back up from that. That's my only point.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say thank you to everybody, for all of your input. Truly, I mean, would far rather have a group of people that is interested, in this. You know, some communities just aren't interested in it, but what it shows is that you love your community, you're interested in what's best for the community. We've gone through this process from the beginning, we've heard the comments, we've responded to those, we've made changes to them multiple times. We've got another round that we're gonna do, and I think there've been good comments, and so I simply say thank you. I appreciate the fact that everybody's gonna be.
One last detail thing, and it just doesn't need discussion, honestly. Forgive me, but in this, I think it's tile number 1, the properties which are in North Greeley, to the west side of North Greeley, there is a setback zone that looks like the properties are actually not developable.
Yeah, we discussed that.
We discussed that.
Thanks.
Can I ask just the timeline so everyone's clear about what our goals are for the next few months, and also even backtracking on when we started, I think would be helpful, just so folks know.
Do you want me to put the slides?
Yep, just real
I
quick.
have a couple
Yeah.
slides if you
Yep.
could.
I think that's important.
It's nice.
See a 2-story building, where's that? Are you doing that Washington? Yeah, waiting for snow, yeah, it's too dry, it's too warm. We did it a week after.
That's a PowerPoint, right?
I
Yeah.
can do it in winter. Stupid as a stupid does.
What's that?
Stupid as a stupid does. Washington expeditions.
So this is the original schedule that we put together as part of our proposal and as part of the contract. And I know you can't really read it that well, but the months are across the top, and where the red circle is basically where we are, just about halfway. Starting in last May, right now we're in January, going through to June or July. Where the red dot is, that orange bar is basically the generic EIS, starting with the existing conditions that we've been doing from our initial meetings with the agencies in town and historical society and so forth, gathering existing conditions, and then we'll go forward with the environmental impact statement. And how do I go next? So this is just a summary, as Eric already showed you on his first slide. The downtown working groups meeting and the public meetings we've been having, and basically starting in May with the kickoff, in June, the first workshop with the placemaking. End of June, we had the video conference. And then in July, we had the workshop where we were much more detailed on the code itself. And then July 23rd, we had that afternoon and evening community presentations where we got input from the communities with all the sticky notes on the boards and all of that kind of thing. Then Eric's group went away and came back with the first draft of the code, presented to this group in November. Took the input and Sabrina's input as well, and developed a second draft of the code, submitted right before Christmas, and then this is where we are today. So we're having our session here, getting more input on the code, and then at the town board, if they decide to do it, we've prepared an environmental assessment form this is, you don't have to read all this, but this is basically the project description that's in the environmental assessment form. It's the amendment of the zoning law to adopt the new code. Is basically what it says, and that it's reflective of the comprehensive plan, and it tells where, it's the entire Hamlet with the business districts and industrial districts in Chappaqua, so it excludes Millwood, it's just Chappaqua. So that's really the first step, to define that. And then, so tonight, we'll talk to the town board about, they are the only lead agency, no one's gonna dispute that, because it's adoption of the code is the action. And we've prepared, as I said, an environmental assessment form, part 1, which reflects that action I just showed you. The part 2, which identifies the impacts, which impacts may be significant or not, and then the part 3 is really just a summary of those impacts that you identified and saying why, therefore, you feel there's impacts that require the preparation of the generic environmental impact statement. So that's the action that will take place tonight if the board decides to do so, or a conditional action if there's additional changes to the code or to any of those documents. And then the next step is to start the public process by setting a public scoping session, which we've prepared a draft scoping outline, which is basically a table of contents for the generic EIS. It says what will be studied and what methodologies will be used and so forth. And that outline will be a draft that we as your consultants prepared, and then you can have input on it, and anyone at the public session can have input on it, and the town board decides which of that input they wanna integrate into their report, doing an amended scope, and then that gets adopted as basically the parameters for the impact statement. Then going forward, basically we talked about today at the top, the public scoping session could be as soon as 2 weeks from now at the next town board meeting. The adoption of the final scope, depending on the extent of the comments, would be sometime in February. Going back to our original schedule with the months on the first page, I projected out to the end of March for this first submission. Then the generic EIS has to be accepted as complete as per the scope, circulated to the agencies, and then there's a public hearing held, which would likely be in early May. After the public hearing is closed and comments are received, they're all addressed in a final EIS, which would be prepared after that. That also has to be accepted as complete and circulated to all the interested agencies. And then a finding statement that summarizes the conclusions of the EIS and the FEIS is adopted. And after that, you finished your secret process and you can adopt the code itself, which would also have a hearing, I imagine. We try to run the hearings concurrently as we could. So that's where we are.
Well, thank you to everyone for coming tonight and for your input.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yep,
It was really helpful, everybody.
What's a form-based